There are medical records that were never intended to be seen by the public. In the damp parishes of Louisiana, sometime around the year 1849, a collection of hospital journals vanished from a small clinic located along the banks of the Mississippi River. Those few who had glimpsed the contents spoke quietly, almost fearfully, about a child whose condition broke every known rule of medicine at that time. 7 doctors examined the boy over a span of 11 months. Not a single one was willing to sign his death certificate. What they witnessed inside that fever-filled room shook their understanding of the human body so deeply that 3 of them left the medical profession entirely within a year. The case was recorded with extreme care, then deliberately hidden. Documents went missing, witnesses declined to talk. Families relocated and changed their names. Tonight, we begin to reconstruct what those doctors saw and why the truth about the Carter child was buried far deeper than his grave. Before we continue with the story of the Carter family, if you are drawn to the dark and forgotten mysteries of America's past, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment telling us which state or city you are listening from. Stories like this deserve to be told, and we are glad you are here to uncover them with us. Now let us step back to where it all started, in a Louisiana community ruled equally by cotton, sickness, and silence. The year was 1849, and the town of Bellefontaine rested along a curve of the Mississippi River, roughly 40 miles south of Baton Rouge. It was not a large settlement, perhaps home to 300 people at most, but it survived and even prospered because of the trade that passed through its port. Cotton bales moved through town every day, stacked high on flatboats and steamers heading toward New Orleans. The air was always heavy, humid enough to curl paper left on a desk overnight, and the smell of river mud blended with magnolia and damp wood. Bellefontaine was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where gossip and unpaid debts carried weight equal to silver coins, and where the arrival of fever season brought a quiet, shared sense of dread each summer. The town itself was built around a single main street with perhaps 20 buildings, including a general store, a tavern, a church, the cotton trading office, a blacksmith shop, and the medical practice of Dr. Nathaniel Gisham. Behind these businesses, wooden homes spread out in uneven rows, some painted, most left bare, all raised on brick pillars to guard against the floods that came with troubling regularity. The people of Bellefontaine lived according to the rhythm of the river and the passing seasons. Spring meant planting. Summer brought unbearable heat and disease. Autumn delivered harvest and profit. Winter offered a short period of rest before the cycle began again. Most families had lived in the region for generations, their fortunes tied closely to the land and the cotton trade. There were wealthy plantation owners who lived upriver but conducted business in town, merchants and clerks who kept commerce moving, laborers who loaded and unloaded cargo at the docks, and enslaved people who worked the fields and performed countless tasks that kept the entire system running. In 1849, the nation itself was beginning to split apart. Arguments about slavery, statehood, and the recently ended Mexican-American War created tension even in small towns. People chose their words carefully and were cautious about whom they trusted. Trust was rare. The Baptist church on the north end of town preached one view of morality, while the Catholic chapel on the south end offered another. Some families openly supported the spread of slavery into new territories, seeing it as an economic need. Others, a quieter group, held doubts they never spoke aloud. Into this world of heat, trade, and unspoken division lived the Carter family, leading what appeared to be an ordinary life. Thomas Carter was 34 years old in the spring of 1849. He worked as a clerk at the Bellefontaine Cotton Exchange and had held the position for 7 years. His job required accuracy, patience, and discretion. He managed ledgers, recorded transactions, calculated weights and prices, and handled correspondence with buyers in New Orleans and beyond. It was steady work, modest in pay but dependable. Thomas was a quiet man, thin and serious, with dark hair beginning to thin at the temples and a habit of chewing the end of his pen when deep in thought. His wife, Margaret, was 31. She had been born in Bellefontaine, the daughter of a ferryman who drowned when she was 12. She learned sewing from her mother and soon showed real skill. By the time she married Thomas at 19, She was already taking in sewing work from wealthier families in the parish, mending clothes, altering dresses, and sometimes making garments from scratch. She worked from a small room in their home where she kept her fabrics, thread, and her prized sewing machine, one of the few in town. They had 3 children. The oldest, Charlotte, was 12 years old, a serious girl with her father's dark hair and careful manner. She helped her mother with sewing and watched over her younger siblings. The middle child, Anne, was 9, lively and curious, always asking questions and often wandering off to explore the riverbank or the woods at the edge of town. Then there was Daniel, 6 years old, the quiet one. Daniel was not often ill, but he had always been pale, fragile in a way his sisters were not. He tired easily and preferred quiet indoor activities over rough games with other boys. He liked to sit and watch his mother sew, following the needle's movement with intense focus. He collected smooth stones from the river and arranged them in careful patterns on the porch. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, his answers were short and thoughtful, as if he weighed each word before saying it. Margaret worried about him as mothers do, but Thomas insisted the boy would grow stronger with time. "He's just thoughtful," Thomas would say. "There's nothing wrong with a thoughtful child." The Carter home was a modest wooden house on the eastern edge of town, close enough to the levee that they could hear the steam whistles of passing boats. It had 4 rooms, a main room for cooking and eating, 2 small bedrooms, and Margaret's sewing room. The furniture was plain but well cared for. Margaret's needlework decorated the walls, samplers with Bible verses and floral designs. A small garden behind the house provided vegetables when the season allowed. They kept chickens in a coop and bought milk from a neighbor who owned a cow. It was a life without luxury, but not without comfort. They were neither rich nor poor, neither prominent nor forgotten. They attended church on Sundays, paid their bills on time, and kept mostly to themselves, exactly the kind of family history usually overlooks. But history would not overlook the Carters. Nathaniel Gisham ran the only medical practice in Bellefontaine, a weathered building with a single examination room, a cramped office where he kept his journals and tools, and a small storage space for medicines and supplies. He was 47 years old in 1849, a graduate of the Medical College of Louisiana in New Orleans, and he had practiced in Bellefontaine for 15 years. Gisham was a careful man, precise in observation and cautious in treatment. He had seen enough to understand the limits of medicine. In 1849, medical science was as much guesswork as discipline. Doctors still believed in the 4 humors, still practiced bloodletting, and still relied on mercury and laudanum for illnesses they could not explain. Germ theory had not yet been accepted. Anesthesia was new and rare. Surgery was a last option, often deadly. Patients trusted Gisham not because he cured everyone, but because he was honest. He told families when nothing more could be done. He admitted when a treatment was experimental. He kept detailed notes on every case, recording symptoms, treatments, and results, believing that careful records were the path to real understanding. His practice was located in a building rented from a merchant named Dupree. The examination room held a wooden table with a thin mattress, a cabinet for tools, a wash basin, and shelves filled with bottles and jars. His instruments were basic: scalpels, forceps, a stethoscope, a fever thermometer, cupping glasses for bloodletting, saws, and probes for serious procedures. He owned a small library of medical books, most already outdated, including Benjamin Rush's writings, a treatise on fevers, and several European case studies. Gisham had treated everything Bellefontaine could produce: fevers, broken bones, difficult births, consumption, cholera, snake bites, knife wounds from tavern fights, burns, and infections. He had lost many patients, but he had also saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. He understood the pattern of illness in town, knew which seasons brought which diseases, and could usually predict what the coming weeks would hold. He was a bachelor, living in 2 rooms above his practice. His work was his life. He had no family in Bellefontaine and few close friends, though he was respected by all. He attended church occasionally, more from social duty than belief. He read medical journals when he could get them, ordered supplies from New Orleans twice a year, and sometimes wrote to former colleagues for advice on difficult cases. In all his years of practice, Dr. Nathaniel Gisham had never seen a case like Daniel Carter. Nothing in his training, his reading, or his experience prepared him for what was about to happen. The morning of June 14, 1849 began like any other. The sun rose into a clear sky, promising another day of crushing heat. Margaret Carter woke early as usual and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Thomas had already left for the cotton exchange, where he needed to finish an inventory before trading began. Charlotte and Anne were still asleep in their shared bed. Margaret was stirring a pot of grits when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Daniel standing in the doorway. He was wearing his nightshirt, barefoot, his light hair messy and uncombed. But something about him felt wrong. He stood completely still, his arms hanging straight down, his eyes open but empty, as if he was looking at nothing at all. "Daniel," Margaret said softly. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" He did not answer. He did not blink. He did not move. Margaret put down the spoon and walked toward him, her heart starting to race. "Daniel, can you hear me?" Still there was no response. She knelt in front of him and placed her hands on his shoulders. His skin was hot, far too hot, like he had been standing too close to a fire. She gasped and pulled her hands away, then reached out again and touched his forehead. He was burning with fever, the heat coming off him in waves. "Thomas," she called out, forgetting for a moment that her husband had already left the house. "Charlotte, come here, quickly." Charlotte came out of the bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes. When she saw her brother standing stiff and silent in the doorway, she stopped cold. "What's wrong with him?" "Go get your father," Margaret said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Run to the cotton exchange. Tell him Daniel is sick. Hurry!" Charlotte ran, her bare feet slapping against the wooden porch as she went. Margaret lifted Daniel, surprised by how stiff and heavy his body felt, and carried him to his bed. She laid him down carefully, but he stayed in the same position, arms at his sides, eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. She brought a cloth and a basin of water, wrung the cloth out, and placed it on his forehead. Within seconds the cloth grew warm. Thomas returned within 15 minutes, Charlotte close behind him. He took one look at Daniel and said at once, "I'll fetch Dr. Gisham." Dr. Gisham arrived before noon. He carried his black leather bag and moved with the steady calm of long habit. He examined Daniel carefully, checking his pulse, listening to his heart, looking into his eyes and mouth, and testing his reflexes by tapping his knees and elbows with a small hammer. The pulse was fast but not dangerously so. The heartbeat sounded normal. His temperature was high, likely around 104 degrees by Gisham's estimate. But what troubled him most was the total lack of response. The boy was clearly awake. His eyes were open and his pupils reacted to light. Yet he showed no awareness of anything around him, no reaction to touch or sound. "How long has he been like this?" Gisham asked. "I found him this morning standing in the kitchen doorway," Margaret said. "He hasn't moved since. He hasn't spoken. He hasn't responded to anything I've said. He hasn't had a fever before this, not recently. He's always been pale and tired easily, but he hasn't been sick." Gisham examined Daniel's arms and legs more closely, noting the stiffness in his muscles. It was not the stiffness of death. The boy was clearly alive. Instead, it was a tight, tense stillness, as if his body were locked in place. "I've seen high fevers cause confusion and delirium," Gisham said slowly. "But I've never seen one cause this kind of complete unresponsiveness. The boy appears awake but unable or unwilling to move." "What does that mean?" Thomas asked. "What's causing it?" "I don't know yet," Gisham said honestly. "It could be a fever from an infection, though I see no clear source. It could involve the nervous system. I will need to watch him closely." He prepared a willow bark tincture to help lower the fever and told Margaret to keep Daniel cool with damp cloths, to try to give him water if she could, and to send for him at once if anything changed. He said he would return the next day. By the following morning, Daniel's condition had worsened in ways that went against everything Gisham understood. Dr. Gisham arrived at the Carter house shortly after dawn on June 15th. Margaret met him at the door, her face pale and worn. She had not slept. "Hay hasn't moved," she said. "Not once. Not a finger, not his eyes, nothing. And doctor, there's something else." She led him to Daniel's room. The boy lay exactly as Jisham had left him the day before, on his back, arms at his sides, eyes open. But when Jisham examined him, he understood Margaret's fear at once. Daniel's body was now completely rigid. Every muscle was tight, frozen in place. Jisham tried to bend the boy's arm and found it almost impossible, as if the joints were fused together. His skin was still hot with fever, but now it felt strangely dry, almost wax-like under the fingers. Even more disturbing were Daniel's eyes. They stared straight up at the ceiling and did not move. They did not follow Jisham as he walked around the bed. They did not blink when Jisham waved his hand in front of them. Yet the pupils still reacted to light when Jisham held a candle close. "Dear God," Jisham whispered, mostly to himself. He tried every test he could think of. He pricked Daniel's skin with a pin in several places. There was no response. He clapped his hands loudly near the boy's ear. Nothing. He gently closed one of Daniel's eyelids and released it. The eye stayed shut for a moment, then slowly, very slowly, opened again. Jisham took out his stethoscope, a fairly new instrument he had owned for only 2 years, and listened to Daniel's heart. What he heard made him listen again, sure he must be wrong. The heartbeat was there, steady and even but very slow. Shockingly slow, perhaps 40 beats per minute, far less than normal for a child. "Is he dying?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jisham did not answer right away. He had been taught never to offer false hope, but he also did not want to declare death without certainty. "His heart is beating," he said at last. "He is breathing. By every measure he is alive. But this condition, I have never seen anything like it." Throughout that day, Jisham tried every treatment he knew. He gave purgatives, hoping to clear any hidden infection from the body. Nothing happened. Daniel did not react at all. He applied heated cupping glasses to the boy's back, drawing blood to the surface as tradition advised. The skin rose and darkened, but Daniel showed no sign of pain. He tried cold cloths, hot cloths, and poultices made from mustard and herbs. Nothing caused any change. By evening, Jisham had to admit defeat, at least for the moment. He left careful instructions for Margaret. Continue using cool cloths. Try to give Daniel liquid drop by drop if needed. Watch closely for any change, no matter how small. He said he would return in the morning, and every morning after, until he understood what was happening. As Jisham walked back to his practice through the heavy evening air, a deep sense of dread settled over him. In 15 years as a doctor, he had seen death. He had seen pain he could not ease. But he had always understood, at least in some way, what was happening: a fever from infection, a wound that turned rotten, a wasting illness that slowly destroyed the lungs. This was different. Daniel Carter was alive but absent, present yet unreachable. It was as if the boy had been taken out of his own body, leaving behind an empty shell that still breathed, and still held a heartbeat for reasons Jisham could not understand. That night, Jisham wrote the first of many journal entries about the case. His handwriting, usually neat and steady, shook more than usual. June 15, 1849. Patient Daniel Carter, male, age 6. Displays severe stiffness of all voluntary muscles, complete lack of response to outside stimuli, and a fever of unknown cause. Pulse approximately 40 beats per minute. Pupils react to light, but eyes do not follow movement. No response to pain, sound, or touch. Unable to speak or move by choice, yet appears awake. I am entirely unable to explain these symptoms. They match no illness I have studied or encountered. Administered willow bark, performed cupping, applied various external treatments. No change observed. Mother reports the child has been in this state for roughly 30 hours. Prognosis unknown. By the 3rd day, news of Daniel Carter's condition had spread throughout Bellintaine. In a town of 300 people, word traveled faster than sickness, and Daniel's illness was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. People whispered in the general store, at church, and along the docks. Stories grew with every telling. Some claimed it was river sickness. Others said it was an illness brought by boats from New Orleans. A few believed it was punishment from God, though no one could say for what sin. Some thought the boy had eaten something poisonous, a bad plant, or spoiled food. The more superstitious spoke quietly of curses and dark forces, though such talk was quickly shut down by those who thought themselves more sensible. The pastor of the Baptist church, Reverend William Holloway, visited the Carter home on June 17th. He was a large man with gray hair and a powerful voice, known for filling his church with fiery sermons about salvation and judgment. But when he saw Daniel lying still in bed, his eyes open and empty, Holloway fell silent. He prayed over the boy, his deep voice filling the small room, yet it trembled with fear. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said to Margaret and Thomas when the prayer ended. "We cannot always understand His purpose, but we must trust that there is meaning in this trial." Margaret nodded, but her eyes looked hollow. She had been sitting by Daniel's bedside for nearly 3 days, leaving only when she had no choice. She had barely eaten and slept only in brief moments. Her hands shook as she wiped Daniel's forehead with a damp cloth, a motion that had become automatic, almost like a ritual, even though it did nothing to ease his fever. Thomas stood near the window, staring out at the street. He had gone to work for a few hours each day, needing the routine and the small sense of normal life. But even there his thoughts never left the room behind him, where his son lay silent and unmoving. He needed something to occupy himself, anything other than standing there watching his son lie motionless like a living body without life. His thoughts kept drifting away, and his supervisor at the Cotton Exchange had already pointed out mistakes in his account books. Charlotte and Anne had been sent to stay with Margaret's sister, who lived about 3 miles outside town. The choice had not been easy, but Margaret would not bend. She did not want the girls to see their brother in this condition. She did not want them exposed to whatever sickness had taken hold of him. The house felt hollow without them, quieter than it had ever been, as though the stillness surrounding Daniel had seeped into every corner of the home. Dr. Gisham now visited twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, carefully writing down every detail of Daniel's condition. At each visit he checked the boy's temperature, pulse, and breathing. He tested the stiffness of the arms and legs, checked reflexes, and studied the eyes closely. He tried several medicines, quinine for fever, mercury for what he believed might be a disorder of the nerves, even opium in the hope that it might bring some kind of reaction. Nothing helped. Nothing changed. By June 20th, 6 days after the illness began, Gisham reached a conclusion: he needed assistance. This case was beyond anything he had encountered before, beyond the limits of his training. That evening he sat at his desk and wrote letters to 3 doctors he knew in New Orleans, describing the situation in as much detail as possible and asking urgently for guidance. He sent the letters on the next steamer traveling downriver, knowing it would take several days before any reply could arrive. What he did not know was that one of those doctors, Dr. Claude Fontaine, would read the letter and immediately book passage on a steamer back to Bellefontaine. Dr. Fontaine had seen something like this before. Claude Fontaine arrived in Bellefontaine on June 22nd, 8 days after Daniel's symptoms had first appeared. He was 52 years old, thin, with sharp features, silver hair, and dark, intense eyes. He had trained in Paris before coming to Louisiana in his 20s, and he carried himself with a European refinement that made some people uneasy. He spoke with a light French accent, and often pressed his lips together when thinking, as though tasting his own ideas. Fontaine had built a successful practice in New Orleans, focusing on tropical diseases and strange illnesses brought by travelers from the Caribbean and South America. He had treated conditions that most American doctors only knew from medical journals: yellow fever, dengue, cholera, parasitic infections that could cause a patient to fade away before your eyes. His experience was broad, his understanding deep, and his fees reflected that. When Gisham met Fontaine at the dock, he was startled by how quickly the doctor had arrived. "I only sent that letter 4 days ago," Gisham said as they shook hands. "I came as soon as I read it," Fontaine replied. "Your description of the symptoms. I needed to see for myself if this is what I believe it is." "You've seen this before?" Gisham asked. Fontaine did not answer right away. "Take me to the child," he said. The examination that followed was the most detailed Daniel had yet endured. Fontaine brought a large leather case filled with instruments Gisham had never encountered before. There was a device for measuring muscle tension, a set of graduated pins to test sensitivity to pain, a specialized ophthalmoscope for examining the back of the eye, along with calipers and various measuring tools. For more than 2 hours Fontaine examined every part of Daniel's body. He measured the pupils, tested reflexes in several places, studied the skin, listened to the heart and lungs, pressed on the abdomen, checked joint movement, and carried out dozens of other tests. Throughout it all, he wrote careful notes in a small leather notebook. Margaret and Thomas watched silently from the doorway, afraid to speak. Gisham stood beside Fontaine, observing closely and occasionally asking about a particular test or measurement. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, life in Bellefontaine went on as usual. Wagons rolled down the street, voices called out, and somewhere in the distance a steamboat whistle sounded. Inside Daniel's room, time seemed to stand still. At last Fontaine straightened, closed his journal, and turned toward Gisham. His face was serious. "I need to speak with you alone," he said. They went to Gisham's office, leaving Margaret and Thomas waiting in nervous silence. Fontaine closed the door, set his bag down, and poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the desk. He drank slowly, collecting his thoughts. 7 years ago, Fontaine began. I was in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, conducting research on tropical fevers. I was asked to examine a child, a boy about 5 or 6 years old, who had developed symptoms very much like what I have just seen in Daniel Carter. Complete muscle stiffness, deep unresponsiveness, a slow heartbeat, and a persistent fever with no clear cause. The local doctors were confused. Some believed it was poisoning from a native plant, others suspected a curse. Such beliefs were still common there. "What happened to the child?" Gisham asked. Fontaine fell quiet, staring into his glass. He remained in that state for 19 days. Then, without warning, he began to move again. At first only his fingers, then his hands. Within a week, most of his movement returned, but he was no longer the same. Changed in what way? He did not recognize his parents. He could not speak, or perhaps would not. He stared at things that were not there and reacted with fear to ordinary objects. Everything that had made him who he was seemed to be gone. He died 3 days later. A chill passed through Gisham despite the warm room. What was listed as the cause of death? The records called it a wasting disease, but that was not true. The child simply stopped. He stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped living, as if whatever had returned him had chosen to leave again. Do you know what caused it? The first symptoms? Fontaine shook his head. I never found a cause. I took tissue samples and studied them with the tools I had. I found no bacteria, no parasites, no poison. His organs appeared completely normal during the examination after death. It was as though his body had chosen to shut down, then partially restart, and then shut down once more. But you must have a theory, Gisham insisted. Fontaine set his glass down and looked directly at him. There are conditions of the nervous system that we do not yet understand. The brain remains a mystery. We know it controls the body, but not exactly how, or how it can fail. I believe, and this is only a theory, that under certain circumstances some children can enter a state where the conscious mind separates from the body's automatic functions. The body continues to breathe and maintain a heartbeat, but the guiding intelligence is gone. Gone where? Gisham asked. That is the question, Fontaine said softly. Perhaps trapped somewhere within the mind, unable to reach the muscles or communicate. Or perhaps somewhere else entirely. Gisham wanted to dismiss this as superstition, but he could not. He had examined Daniel Carter himself and found no explanation. If Fontaine, with all his knowledge and experience, believed this was possible, then it had to be considered. What do you suggest? Gisham asked. Observe carefully. Record everything. Keep the child as comfortable as possible. Try to provide nourishment. His body will need it to survive. And prepare the family for the chance that he may not recover, or that if he does, he may not be the same child they remember. If you are still listening, you may be asking the same questions the people of Bellefontaine were asking. How was this child still alive, and what was happening inside his mind during those long weeks of silence? If this story sends chills down your spine, share it with someone who enjoys dark mysteries. Support the content and make sure you stay with us as we uncover what happens next. In the weeks that followed, Bellefontaine turned into a kind of destination for doctors. News of Daniel Carter's conditions spread through medical circles across Louisiana and beyond, drawing physicians who were curious, doubtful, or eager to build a reputation by solving an impossible case. Dr. Samuel Vickery arrived on July 3rd. He was a traveling doctor, large and loud, in his 60s, dressed in costly suits and carrying a black bag and a bottle of whiskey. Vickery had built his name treating wealthy plantation owners across the South, and he carried himself like a man who believed he had seen it all and could fix anything. He examined Daniel for no more than 20 minutes before declaring, "Nervous fever brought on by river miasma. I've seen it many times." Gisham and Fontaine, who had remained in Bellefontaine, exchanged doubtful looks. "What treatment do you advise?" Gisham asked. "Strong purging to cleanse the system, hot cupping to draw out bad humors, and a tonic of my own creation, a secret formula. Works wonders." What followed was one of the most painful parts of the entire ordeal. Vickery gave Daniel a purgative so powerful it should have emptied a grown man within minutes. Daniel's body did not react at all. Vickery doubled the dose. Still nothing. He then applied heated cups to Daniel's back with such force that dark marks bloomed across the boy's pale skin. There was no response. Finally, Vickery poured several spoonfuls of his secret tonic, sharp with alcohol and something bitter, into Daniel's mouth. The liquid slid toward the back of his throat. For a terrifying moment, it looked as if he might choke. Margaret screamed. Gisham quickly turned Daniel's head to the side, and the liquid spilled onto the pillow. "Get out," Thomas Carter said, his voice shaking with rage. "Get out of my house." Vickery left, without saying another word. He was never seen in Bellefontaine again. Later it was discovered that he had no real medical education at all, that his reputation came from fake cures and pure luck, but at the time his failure only made the mystery around Daniel Carter feel deeper. Dr. Enoch Landry arrived from Lafayette on July 10th. He was a younger man in his early 30s and had studied diseases at a hospital in Boston. He brought with him a more modern and scientific method. He measured electroactive activity in Daniel's muscles using a device called a galvanometer. He tested reflexive tool and alternative stimulation for a stayed in Bellefontaine for an experiment from an and for an writing careful move. For a move for only lead more live for man. His conclusion was troubling. The voluntary nervous system appears to be entirely inactive while the autonomic nervous system continues to function. This points to a serious separation between the conscious mind and the body's ability to move. I have read about similar cases in medical journals, conditions involving complete paralysis or sickness, but I have never seen anything this, and any this total or this lasting. "Can it be treated?" Thomas asked. "I do not know," Landry said honestly. "The nervous system is still not well understood. We do not know how to repair it or even how to locate the damage. All I can say is that your son's condition is unlike anything I have seen." Dr. Margaret Dufresne arrived from Alexandria on July 15th. She was one of the very few women doctors practicing in Louisiana, and her arrival unsettled some of the more trivial residents of Bellefontaine. Still, her qualifications were strong. She trained in Philadelphia and had written several papers on childhood illness. The Carters were desperate and willing to accept help from anyone. Dufresne approached the case differently than the men. She spent less time studying Daniel's body and more time speaking with Margaret and Thomas. She asked careful questions about Daniel's life before he became ill. What kind of child was he? What made him happy? What scared him? Had anything strange happened in the weeks or 4 months before his condition began? Had he spoken about odd dreams or worries? Margaret told her everything she could remember. Daniel had always been quiet and thoughtful. He sometimes had nightmares, waking up crying, though he could never explain what he had seen. He feared thunderstorms, the dark cellar where drowns were stored, and a certain bend in the river where a boy had drowned in years, and ran to him even if no one utterance that felt important to us. No one else's ways. No one else understood them. Dufresne listened closely and wrote everything down. On her last night in Bellefontaine, she shared her thoughts with Gisham, And Fontaine, I believe this is an illness of the mind, not the body, she said, or rather a mental injury that has expressed itself, a deep psychological show in the heart that would not seem serious to an L-Pel terrifying to a call in response his mind has, with broken and legally responsible from the body, not in self from the body. That cannot happen, Landry argued. The mind cannot simply detach from the body. Can it not? Dufresne replied. We see cases of hysterical paralysis, blindness, and deafness, with no physical cause. We know the mind can control the body. Why could it not, in extreme situations, create a total separation? The discussion lasted late into the night, but no agreement was reached. Dufresne returned to Alexandria, leaving behind a detailed report that added to Daniel's growing file, but did nothing to give the family hope. By late July, Daniel had been paralyzed for 6 weeks. The Carter house had turned into a museum of failed medicine. Doctors came, examined, speculated, and left. Each visit lifted Margaret's wholly to crush them again. Every departure left her more broken than before. She stopped leaving the house altogether, her sewing thin, her touch. She grew thin, her face hollow, her hands sharp and bony. She stayed beside Daniel's bed day and night, speaking to him constantly, telling stories, singing lullabies, describing the world outside the window, begging him to return to her. Today is Charlotte's birthday, she would say. She is 12 now. Can you believe that? I know you miss her. She misses you too. She will be home soon, and when she comes you need to be awake to see her. Can you do that, Daniel? Can you wake up for your sister? Thomas returned to full-time work, but he was no longer the same. His supervisor stopped trusting him with important tasks after finding repeated mistakes in the ledgers. He moved through his days like a machine, doing what was required without truly in it present. Night he sat in the main room staring, nothing sometimes, then drinking from a bottle of whiskey hidden behind the wood pile. The town's early curiosity turned into something colder. Some families avoided the Carters crossing the street when they saw Thomas, or making excuses when Margaret asked for help. There was a growing belief that whatever had happened to Daniel was catching, or that the family was cursed. One night in early August, a group of men fueled by alcohol and fear gathered outside the Carter house. They did not act directly. They stood talking loudly about how unnatural the situation was, about how some things should be left to gods, well, about how it might be kinder if the boy simply died. Thomas confronted them, and a fight followed. He was badly beaten, with broken ribs and a fractured cheekbone. Dr. Gisham treated him, but the deeper wounds were not physical. After that, Thomas stopped working entirely. The family's income disappeared. They survived only on charity from the few neighbors who still cared. Gisham continued his daily visits, though they had become routine. He checked Daniel's vital signs, looked for any change, and sat with Margaret, offering quiet comfort. He had stopped trying new treatments. Everything possible had already been tried and failed. His journal from this time shows a man facing the limits of his calling. August 7, 1849, day 54, patient turns to 38, 2 BTH, pulse temperature elevated but steady, no voluntary movement, no response to stimulus. I have consulted every book on him, read no treatment, nothing. Am forced to accept that there are states the human body can enter that medicine white movement without any quality. And I do not know. I begin to understand why some disappointment that present the opposite of the highly overwhelming Merlin when the flying weights and with these movie when finest light when we're rewinding. Then on the night of August 19th, something finally shifted. Margaret sat in her usual place beside Daniel's bed. It was after midnight. The house was quiet except for the soft creak of wood and a distant steamboat whistle on the river. She hummed the same lullaby she had sung to Daniel as a baby when she noticed a change in his eyes. For weeks they had stared without focus. Now they were moving slowly, drifting back and forth, as if following something invisible. Margaret stopped humming and leaned closer. Daniel, she whispered, can you hear me? His eyes moved again, settling on her face for the first time in 66 days. Margaret's breath caught. She reached for his hand. It was still stiff, but something had changed. A tension she had not felt before. Then his fingers moved. It was a tiny motion, almost nothing, but she saw it. She jumped up so fast her chair fell backward. Thomas, come quickly, he is moving. Thomas staggered in, confused from sleep and drink. What is happening? His hand, I saw his fingers move. They stared at Daniel's hand for a long moment, nothing. Then slowly, painfully slowly, his right hand lifted from the bed. It hung in the air for about 5 seconds, shaking hard before dropping back down. Thomas ran. He ran through the dark streets of Bellefontaine to Dr. Gisham's office, pounding on the door until the doctor appeared, rumpled and half awake. "He is moving," Thomas gasped. "Daniel is moving." They returned together to the Carter house, finding Margaret kneeling beside the bed, tears pouring down her face. Daniel's head was turning gently from side to side, his hands clenched and released in a steady rhythm. Gisham examined him quickly, checking pulse, temperature, reflexes. The stiffness was fading, the muscles were waking up. Daniel's eyes were open now, aware, following movement around the room. His mouth opened and closed as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came. "This is extraordinary," Gisham said, his voice unsteady. "After all this time the paralysis is breaking. I do not know how or why, but he is returning." Over the next 3 days, Daniel slowly regained the ability to move. First his hands and feet began to move, then his arms and legs followed, and after that his torso slowly responded. By August 22nd he was able to sit upright with help. On August 23rd he managed to stand, though his body shook and he could barely keep balance. By August 24th he could take a few steps when someone supported him. Yet even while his body showed signs of healing, it became clear that something was deeply wrong. The Daniel Carter who came out of the paralysis was not the same boy who had gone into it. Anyone who saw him noticed the difference right away. He did not speak at all, not a single word or sound. When his mother asked him questions, he looked at her blankly, as if he could not understand her words. When his father tried to hug him, Daniel pulled back, his face filled with fear and confusion, as though Thomas were a stranger. His actions were strange in ways that were hard to explain but impossible to ignore. He would sit completely still for hours, staring at one spot on the wall or at his own hands. He flinched from touch, from loud noises, from sudden movements. At night he refused to sleep in his bed. Instead, he curled up under furniture, hiding in the darkest corners of the house he could find. Dr. Gisham was confused and troubled. Physically, Daniel appeared to be getting better. His muscle strength was returning. His reflexes were normal. His fever had finally gone away. But mentally and emotionally, the child seemed gone. Dr. Fontaine, who had stayed in Bellefontaine through the entire ordeal, examined Daniel carefully and repeatedly. He tried to reach the boy through hand movements, pictures, and every method he could think of. Nothing worked. Daniel seemed locked inside himself, unable or unwilling to connect with the world around him. On August 26th, Margaret was sitting beside Daniel in his room when he spoke for the first time. His voice was rough and very soft, and his words were simple, but they sent fear through everyone who heard them. They were always there. Margaret leaned closer, desperate to understand. "Who was always there, Daniel? What do you mean?" For a brief moment, Daniel looked directly at her, and she saw recognition, saw her son looking back. Then it vanished, replaced once again by that empty, distant stare. "Watching," he whispered, "always watching." After that, he did not speak again for 3 days. Dr. Herbert Lane arrived from New Orleans on August 29th. He was a specialist in mental disorders, one of the few doctors in America who had studied in Europe, where new ideas about trauma and the mind were developing. He spent a full week with Daniel, observing him closely, trying different treatments and writing detailed notes. Lane's conclusion was unsettling. "The child has suffered severe psychological trauma, though I cannot identify the cause. It is as if he witnessed or experienced something so horrifying that his mind cannot handle it. He has withdrawn into himself as a way to protect himself. Whether he will ever fully return is impossible to say. But what could have caused such trauma?" Margaret asked. "He was only a child. He had normal nightmares sometimes, nothing unusual, nothing that explains this." Lane slowly shook his head. "The human mind, especially a child's mind, can be harmed by things we would never expect. Sometimes the trauma happens during the illness itself. If he was conscious during those weeks of paralysis, if he was aware but unable to move or speak, that alone could have been terrifying." "You mean he was trapped inside his own body for 2 months, aware the entire time?" Thomas asked, his face drained of color. "I'm saying it's possible," Lane replied. We don't know, and we may never know. September brought no improvement. Daniel continued to decline, though in different ways than before. He could move now, but it felt as though he was wasting away from the inside. He ate very little, and Margaret had to feed him with a spoon like a baby. He kept losing weight, his skin turned gray and pale. His eyes sank deeper into his face. His hair began falling out in clumps. When he spoke, it was rare and always the same words. They were watching. They never left. They were waiting. If anyone asked who they were, Daniel became upset, sometimes violent, flailing his arms and making weak sounds that might have been screams if he had more strength. The house felt like a prison. Margaret never left Daniel's side. Thomas had stopped trying to function at all. They had no money, no savings, and survived only on charity, which was slowly running out. As the patience of the community faded, on September 5th, Dr. Fontaine made an announcement. He was leaving Bellefontaine. He had patients in New Orleans who needed him, and there was nothing more he could do for Daniel Carter. Before leaving, he met privately with Gisham. "I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone else," Fontaine said. "That child in Port-au-Prince, the one I mentioned before, there was something I did not tell you about his death." "Go on," Gisham said. "In the days before he died, the boy spoke. Not much, only fragments, but always the same idea. He talked about being watched, about things waiting for him. His exact words, which I wrote down, were, 'They never stop watching, even when you close your eyes.' 3 days later he was dead." "And you think Daniel is saying the same things?" Gisham asked. "Not just similar things," Fontaine replied. "In some cases the exact same words, the same phrases, the same tone. It's as if they both saw the same thing." "What do you think they saw?" Fontaine was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I think they went somewhere. During the paralysis, I believe their minds went somewhere else, and they saw something there. Something terrible. When they came back, they could not forget it. They could not escape it." "That's not a medical explanation," Gisham said. "No, it's not," Fontaine agreed. "But in 30 years of medicine, I've learned that some things do not fit into our books. There are things we cannot name and may never understand." Fontaine left the next morning. Gisham never saw him again. By early September, Daniel stopped eating completely. Margaret tried everything. Soups, broth, soft bread, anything she thought he might swallow. He turned his head away, closed his mouth tightly, or let the food fall out. His weight dropped so low that he looked skeletal, his bones visible beneath thin skin. Dr. Gisham knew the end was near. He had seen enough death to recognize the signs. He tried to prepare Margaret and Thomas, though no words could truly prepare parents to lose a child like this. On September 12th, Daniel opened his eyes and seemed to truly see Margaret for the first time in weeks. She was sitting beside him as always. When he looked at her, his expression changed. For a brief moment he was her son again. "Mama," he whispered. Margaret broke down in tears and grabbed his hand. "I'm here, baby, I'm here. I was so far away," Daniel said softly. "I couldn't find my way back. You're here now," she cried. "You're home." Daniel closed his eyes. "They're still watching," he murmured. "They never stop." Those were the last clear words he ever spoke. For the next 3 days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. His breathing grew weaker, his pulse faint. Margaret held his hand constantly, talking to him, singing to him, refusing to let go. Daniel Carter died on the morning of September 15, 1849, exactly 3 months after his symptoms began. He stopped breathing quietly while his mother held him. There was no struggle, no final moment of panic. One moment he was barely alive, and the next he was gone. Margaret did not scream or cry. She sat there holding his hand, staring at his still face, as if she could not accept what had happened. Thomas had to gently pull her away so Dr. Gisham could confirm the death. Dr. Gisham stood in his examination room, looking down at Daniel Carter's body, and made a decision he knew would be questioned. He needed to know what had killed this child. He needed answers, if not for the Carters, then for himself and for medicine, in case another child ever showed the same symptoms. He went to the Carter home and made his request. Margaret refused immediately, horrified by the idea of her son's body being opened. Thomas also resisted, but Gisham continued, explaining that Daniel's death should have meaning, should help others, should prevent another family from suffering the same way. After hours of painful discussion, Margaret and Thomas finally agreed under strict conditions. The autopsy would be private, the body would be treated with respect. The findings would not be shared without their consent. The autopsy took place on September 16th, with Dr. Landry and Dr. Dufresne present as witnesses. Gisham had asked them to remain in Bellefontaine for this reason, knowing the case was too unusual for a single opinion. What they discovered, or rather what they failed to discover, became the most baffling part of the case. Daniel's internal organs were normal. His heart showed no disease or defect. His lungs were clear, his liver, kidneys, and spleen were healthy. His stomach and intestines showed signs of starvation, but no illness. His brain showed no tumors, no bleeding, no damage of any kind. "This is impossible," Landry said quietly. "This child should not have been sick. There is nothing wrong with him." But there was one strange finding, and Dr. Dufresne noticed it first. The muscles, especially in the arms and legs, showed a pattern of wasting that made no medical sense. Some muscle groups had almost completely shrunk, as if they had not been used for years. Yet nearby muscles, connected to the same nerves and blood supply, appeared normal. The damage followed no clear pattern and defied any known explanation. Landry collected tissue samples from several parts of the body, taking great care to seal and preserve them in jars filled with alcohol. These samples were later sent to fellow physicians in New York and Boston so they could be studied under microscopes. When the reports finally returned months afterward, they only added to the confusion. The tissue was described in different ways, but all agreed it was strange in its cellular makeup, showing signs of early aging and resisting any normal histological classification. Gisham completed the autopsy with a sense of dread and sorrow. Writing the final report weighed heavily on him. His conclusion was blunt and impossible to avoid. A full examination of the body failed to uncover any physical cause of death. All major organs appeared normal and healthy. There was slight muscle wasting, but it was not enough to explain the extreme symptoms seen while the child was alive. The cause of death remained unknown. He shared his findings with Landry and Dufresne, expecting disagreement or at least new ideas. Instead, Dufresne agreed completely. Neither man could offer an explanation. They could not honestly blame Daniel's death on any illness known to medicine. The issue of the death certificate then arose. In Louisiana in 1849, a death could not be officially recorded without a cause. Gisham wrote letters to the other doctors who had examined Daniel, including Fontaine, Vicky, and Lane, asking for their professional judgment for the record. Fontaine never replied. Victory could not be found. Lane answered with a short note saying he believed the death may have resulted from failure of the nervous system, brought on by psychological trauma, but he admitted this idea was only speculation and that he could not sign a certificate based on it. In the end, not one of the 7 doctors who had examined Daniel Carter was willing to sign the death certificate. It was filed with the parish clerk, listing the cause of death simply as undetermined. This kind of admission was almost unheard of at the time, a public confession that 7 trained physicians, armed with all their learning and experience, had been defeated by the illness of a single 6-year-old boy. Daniel was buried by his family in the small cemetery on the edge of Bellefontaine on September 18, 1849. Very few people attended the funeral. Reverend Hole led the service, but his sermon was short and awkward, filled with empty phrases about God's will and the unknowable nature of faith. Most of the town chose not to come. Margaret stood at the grave motionless, not crying, not speaking, barely even breathing. Thomas held her arm to keep her from collapsing. Dr. Gisham was there, along with Dr. Landry and Dr. Drain, who had stayed to see the case through to the end. A handful of neighbors attended, mostly out of duty rather than affection. Charlotte and Anne, brought back from their aunt's home for the burial, stood side by side holding hands, looking frightened and confused. The gravestone was plain, made by a local stonecutter who felt sympathy for the family's lack of money. It carried only Daniel's name and the years of his birth and death. Daniel Carter, 1843-1849. There was no epitaph, no verse from scripture, no explanation. Just a name and 2 dates marking the short life of a boy whose death would trouble everyone who remembered him. In the weeks and months that followed, the Carter family slowly fell apart. Margaret never truly recovered. She almost completely stopped speaking, stopped caring for herself, and withdrew from the world. She spent whole days sitting alone in Daniel's empty room, staring at nothing. Thomas tried to look after her, but he too was shattered, unable to work or function normally. When they could no longer afford rent, they lost their home and moved in with Margaret's sister, all of them living in a single room and surviving on charity. Charlotte and Anne were forced to grow up quickly, taking on adult duties to help support what remained of the family. They worked in the houses of wealthier people, cleaning, cooking, and watching children. As soon as they were old enough, both girls left Louisiana. Charlotte moved to Mobile, Alabama, where she married a shopkeeper. Anne went north to St. Louis. Neither ever returned to Bellefontaine, and neither spoke of their brother again, not even to their own children many years later. Thomas died in 1852, 3 years after Daniel. His death was officially recorded as consumption, but those who knew him believed he died from grief and despair. Margaret lived 7 years longer, trapped in constant sorrow, never fully present and never fully herself. She died in 1859 in the same room where Daniel had spent his last months, whispering his name with her final breath, Dr. Gisham continued practicing medicine in Bellefontaine for another 14 years, but the Daniel Carter case changed him deeply. His journals began to fill with philosophical thoughts about the limits of medicine, about mysteries beyond human understanding, and about the pride involved in believing everything can be explained by science and logic. He wrote less about treatments and more about uncertainty. He questioned methods he had once used without hesitation. He became more careful, more modest, and more willing to admit when he did not know an answer. Some townspeople thought he had lost his confidence. Others believed he had gained wisdom. In 1860, he wrote a journal entry that captured his thoughts in the years after Daniel's death. He wrote that he had practiced medicine for 26 years, treated hundreds of patients, witnessed countless diseases, and observed the human body in nearly every condition imaginable. He had studied books, consulted colleagues, and attended lectures and demonstrations. He had devoted his life to understanding the body and what could be done when it failed. Yet the case that troubled him most was the one he could not explain, treat, or even properly diagnose. Daniel Carter's illness and death showed him the deep limits of medical knowledge. Doctors pretend to understand much, he wrote, but in truth they understand very little. The human body and mind remain mysteries capable of conditions that defy all theories and treatments. Perhaps this is how it is meant to be. Perhaps some parts of human existence are meant to remain unknown forever. Or perhaps medicine simply has not learned enough yet, and someday future doctors will look back on their crude understanding and be amazed by their ignorance. He did not know which idea disturbed him more. The story of Daniel Carter soon faded from public memory. Bellefontaine moved on to new tragedies, scandals, and events. In 1850, yellow fever swept through the area, killing dozens. The economic troubles of the 1850s brought widespread hardship. Then the Civil War arrived and changed everything, leaving the old antebellum world unrecognizable. Dr. Gisham died in 1863 during the Union occupation of Louisiana. His medical practice was closed, and his building was taken over for military use. His journals, dozens of leather-bound volumes covering 30 years of work, were boxed up by a distant cousin who inherited his few possessions. They sat forgotten in an attic in Baton Rouge for decades, collecting dust. It was not until 1891 that the journals were donated to the Louisiana State Medical Society by the cousin's daughter while she was clearing out her family home. They were cataloged and stored away, one collection among many, considered mildly interesting from a historical point of view, but not especially important. There they remained for another 80 years. In the 1970s, a medical historian named Dr. Robert Chen was studying 19th-century medical practices in the American South. He was especially interested in how doctors handled illnesses they could not explain. While spending weeks in the Society's archives reading old journals and case reports, he discovered Dr. Nathaniel Gisham's volumes. The entries about Daniel Carter immediately stood out. The level of detail, the careful observation, and the clear confusion of an experienced doctor facing something beyond his knowledge were remarkable. Chen spent months searching for every reference he could find related to the case. He uncovered letters from Dr. Fontaine in the archives of Charity Hospital in New Orleans. He found a short mention in an 1851 medical journal referring to a Louisiana paralysis case. He also located parish records confirming Daniel's death and the rare listing of the cause as undetermined. In 1977, Chen published his research in a paper titled An Unexplained Pediatric Case from Antebellum Louisiana Medical Mystery or Documentation Failure. It appeared in a little-known medical history journal and received little attention at the time. Most readers assumed it simply showed how limited 19th-century medicine was, especially in understanding neurological illness. Still, a small number of researchers were intrigued. In 1984, a neurologist in Boston read Chen's paper and suggested that Daniel may have suffered from acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, a rare autoimmune disorder that can cause sudden paralysis and changes in consciousness. Others proposed viral encephalitis, Gillen syndrome, or even a psychosomatic condition. None of these ideas fully explained all of Daniel's symptoms, especially the long-lasting paralysis with awareness, the extremely slow pulse, the ability to survive weeks with very little food, and the severe personality changes after movement returned. In 1995, a psychiatrist named Dr. Alicia Torres suggested a more radical explanation. She proposed that Daniel experienced what she called extreme dissociative catatonia, a condition where intense psychological trauma causes the mind to shut down the body almost completely. She pointed to modern cases of traumatized children who entered deep states of withdrawal. Even so, these modern examples did not match the length of time or the full physical changes described in Daniel's case. In 2003, Dr. Laura Hensley, a semi-retired physician with a strong interest in historical medical mysteries, came across Dr. Chen's 1977 paper while researching an unrelated topic. She became instantly fascinated by the case. She read everything that had been written about it, and then began her own investigation. Hensley traveled to Louisiana multiple times over the years. Over the next 8 years she returned again and again to the place where Bellefontaine had once existed. By the early 20th century the town had slowly been absorbed into a larger city and no longer had a clear identity of its own. She searched deeply through parish files, church documents, burial records, and any other sources that might offer new details about the Carter family or the doctors who treated Daniel. She managed to trace living descendants of Dr. Gisham, Dr. Fontaine, and Dr. Landry. She also found a great-great-granddaughter of Charlotte Carter who was living in Florida. This woman had never heard about her ancestor's tragic brother, but she agreed to speak about the family. She located the cemetery where Daniel had been buried and found his grave marker worn down and covered with weeds, yet still readable. Most surprising of all, in a storage building in Lafayette that was about to be torn down, Hensley uncovered a box of documents that had belonged to Dr. Landry. Inside were the tissue samples taken during Daniel's autopsy, still sealed in their original glass containers. The preserving alcohol had long since dried up, but the tissue itself was still there. With approval from the Carter family descendants, Hensley arranged for these samples to be examined using modern methods. Using 21st-century tools such as DNA sequencing, electron microscopes, and immunohistochemistry, scientists at Louisiana State University studied the 60-year-old tissue samples. Their findings were published in 2011, but they did not provide clear answers. The tissue had broken down due to age and poor storage, which made firm conclusions impossible. Even so, the researchers noticed several unusual features. The muscle tissue showed strange patterns of cell damage that did not match any known illness. There were signs that suggested some kind of immune reaction, but it did not resemble common infections or autoimmune diseases. Most interesting was the structure of some cells, which one researcher described as showing early senescence. The cells looked far older than expected, as though they had aged many years in only a short time. This kind of change had been seen before in rare genetic conditions and in extreme physical stress, but never at this level and never in such a young child. Dr. Hensley gathered all of her findings into a book released in 2011 titled The Silent Child, an Unsolved Medical Mystery. The book offered the most detailed account of Daniel Carter's case ever put together. It included passages from Dr. Gisham's journals, letters written by the other doctors, interviews with family descendants, and opinions from modern medical specialists. Her conclusion was written with care. She stated that Daniel Carter's case represented either an extremely rare condition never again recorded in medical history, or a mix of factors, environmental, genetic, psychological, and infectious, that came together to create symptoms we still cannot fully explain even today. What is beyond doubt is that the child suffered in ways that are hard to imagine, and that his case revealed the limits of both 19th century and modern medicine. There are still mysteries within the human body that remain unsolved. There are illnesses that do not fit neatly into medical categories, and conditions that challenge our understanding of how the mind and body truly function. Even now, more than 170 years after Daniel Carter's death, many questions remain unanswered. What caused the paralysis in the first place? Why did it continue for so long? How did his body survive weeks with almost no food? What did he experience during those months when he could not move? What caused the changes in his personality once movement returned? And finally, what actually caused his death? Modern doctors who have reviewed the case suggest different explanations, but none fully satisfy all the details. Some neurologists believe it may have been a rare type of encephalitis that damaged specific areas of the brain, blocking voluntary movement while leaving basic body functions intact. But this theory does not explain the long duration or how he lived without proper nutrition. Some psychiatrists suggest dissociative disorders and the powerful impact of trauma on a developing brain. However, known cases of childhood dissociation do not show such extreme physical paralysis or bodily changes. Other researchers have proposed exposure to environmental toxins, possibly something in the Mississippi River water, a poisonous plant, or even intentional poisoning. Yet the autopsy found no toxins, and no similar cases were reported in Bellefontaine at that time. A few have suggested that Daniel suffered from several conditions at once. Perhaps a neurological infection triggered a severe psychological reaction, combined with a hidden genetic weakness. But this remains speculation built upon speculation, with no way to confirm it. The most honest answer is simply that we do not know. Despite all medical progress and our advanced understanding of the brain, mind, and body, Daniel Carter's case remains unexplained. If Daniel Carter's story has any lasting meaning, it is this. It reminds us of how limited human knowledge truly is and how mystery continues to exist even in an age of science and technology. The 7 doctors who examined Daniel were not careless or unskilled. They were trained men working with the best knowledge and tools of their time. Dr. Gisham carefully recorded every detail. Dr. Fontaine had wide experience with rare illnesses. Dr. Landry was educated in the newest neurological ideas of his era, and still they failed. Not because they were poor doctors, but because they encountered something beyond medical understanding. Even today, with MRI scanners, genetic testing, brain imaging, and advanced blood analysis, we cannot say with certainty what happened to Daniel. We can suggest theories and educated guesses, but no final answer exists. This should humble us. It should remind us that despite progress, there are still conditions that confuse even the best doctors, and there are cases where we must admit, as Dr. Gisham did, that we simply do not know. Daniel Carter's grave still lies in what is now called Riverside Memorial Cemetery. The original plain headstone has been replaced over time, but the current marker still shows the same basic facts. Daniel Carter, 1843 to 1849. If you stand there on a quiet day, you will see an ordinary grave in an ordinary cemetery. Nothing suggests the medical mystery behind it. Nothing shows the suffering endured. Nothing honors the 7 doctors who tried and failed to save him. Perhaps that is fitting, because Daniel Carter was simply a child, not a medical case or a curiosity, but a 6-year-old boy who liked collecting stones and watching his mother sew. A child who sometimes had bad dreams, who feared thunderstorms, and who died far too young after suffering in ways we can barely understand. His story lives on not because it gives answers, but because it raises questions we still cannot answer. What are the limits of the human body? What can the mind endure in altered states? What hidden mysteries remain inside us waiting for the right or wrong moment to appear? Dr. Gisham's final journal entry about Daniel Carter, written in December 1849, 3 months after the boy's death, may express it best. He wrote that he had thought often of young Daniel in the months since his passing. He reviewed his notes again and again, hoping to find something he had overlooked, some detail that would explain everything. He found nothing. He was forced to accept that he had witnessed something he could not explain, something that challenged every lesson he had been taught and every belief he held about illness and the human body. If there was any lesson in the tragedy, it was humility. Doctors often carry themselves with confidence, believing they understand life and death. But the truth is that they know very little. They see only the surface, observing symptoms and offering treatments. The deeper mysteries, what creates consciousness, how the mind and body connect, what spark gives life and then leaves, remain beyond reach. Daniel Carter suffered and died, and he could not be saved. That failure stayed with the doctor forever. Yet perhaps the suffering was not entirely without meaning. Perhaps future doctors with tools and knowledge beyond imagination will one day understand what could not be understood then. Or perhaps the case will always remain a mystery, reminding us that some parts of human existence lie beyond medicine and science. The doctor admitted he did not know which belief he held. He only knew that he tried his best, and his best was not enough. And no matter how far medicine advances, there will always be cases like Daniel's, mysteries that resist explanation and remind us of our limits. Perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps complete understanding would take away life's mystery and depth. Or perhaps it was simply an old doctor searching for meaning in a child's tragic death. May Daniel's soul rest in peace, and may his memory remind future physicians to practice medicine with humility, wonder, and the understanding that there will always be more to learn. This mystery shows that even in our modern world, with all medical and scientific progress, there are still cases that cannot be explained, conditions that challenge everything we believe about the human body. What do you think about this story? Do you believe all the truth has been uncovered? Was Daniel Carter suffering from an unknown illness, a psychological condition, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts and your theory. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales like this, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who loves mysteries. The past holds many secrets, and we are here to explore them together. See you in the next one.